Hello everyone, welcome to Byjus Exam Prep IAS. Today in this session we are going to have a discussion on the newspaper of 8th of May 2024. So let's begin with the list of articles first. But before we start, there is a quick announcement for all of you that we are going to very soon conduct a new workshop, and this workshop is going to be conducted on 12th of May. And for every one of you who is preparing for UPSC Civil Services Examination 2025, this is going to be a must visit session. So do subscribe to the channel and please wait for the session, and we are going to go live at 11 a.m. on 12th of May. So let's begin with the list of articles first, and today we have these 4 articles that we are going to discuss in detail. 1. A dignified peaceful passing is everyone's right. This is something which is related to something called as a living will. We'll try to understand what do we mean by a living will and the various aspects related to it. Then something related to plastic and the recently concluded plastic treaty, and some of the aspects of that is what we are going to discuss in this second article. Then the third article is about heat waves and the predictions of heat waves and how do they go wrong. So that is what we are going to discuss here. And then the unseen effects of climate change on mental health. So how mental health is related to climate change, and some of the figures, some of the studies, what they have revealed is what we are going to discuss in this fourth article. Then from the perspective of your prelims examination, there are 2 topics. One related to West Nile fever. We'll discuss the various aspects of it. And then a new disease that has been seen, or an increased number of disease that has been seen in maize. So we'll discuss about that. And then 3 articles from the revisited headlines. One, first 2 related to Israel-Palestine issue and the Gaza crisis that we see. So we'll discuss some of aspects of it. And then 1 article related to the advertisements, something that we have discussed in the past as well, especially in regard to the Patanjali case. So let's begin with the very first article that we have on your editorial page today. A dignified, peaceful passing is everyone's right. Now, this article, this is basically talking about something called as a living will. What we call as a living will. So what do we mean by a living will is what we are going to discuss in this particular article. Now, first, before we go to the article, let's also try to understand what do we mean by a living will. Now, a living will basically is a healthcare directive, and this is where people can state their wishes for their end of life care in case they are not in a position to make that decision. So this is basically what we call as a living will. Now, when it comes to a living will, so that's why this is basically is a healthcare directive. It's a kind of healthcare directive in which people can they can state their wishes, right? They can state their wishes for their end of life care, in case they are not in a position, to make that decision. So this is what we call as a living will. And a document page that you see here, this is how a living will is written. After the session, I'll also ask the team to attach a PDF document of how exactly a living will is made. Now the question is, who can make a living will? An adult with a sound and healthy mind can make this will, and it is something that should be voluntarily and it has to be executed voluntarily, and it has to be based on informed consent. It should be expressed in very specific terms in a language absolutely clear and unambiguous. This is what the courts also have ruled. And what exactly does it contain? It contains the circumstances in which a medical treatment should be withheld or withdrawn. And that's why it should specify that the will can be revoked at any time as well. It should give the name of the guardian or the close relative who will give the go ahead for starting the procedure of passive euthanasia if required. And if there are more than one living will, the latest one that has been created will be the one which is valid. So these are the things, few of the things that you should know when it comes to the living will. Now, coming to the article and what the article talks about, it talks about how there is a difference between the Western approach versus the Indian approach, or let's say the Eastern approach. Now here it starts with an example or a case, you can say, where we see a comparison between how Ronald Reagan passed away versus how Atal Bihari Vajpayee had passed away. Ronald Reagan, who was the 40th President of the United States, he had died in 2004 at the age of 93 years. And he died after living for 9 years with dementia. Now, his death was supposedly peaceful, surrounded by family at home. His wife, she had called it the greatest gift that he could have given her. In contrast, when we look at India's former Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee, he had passed away in 2018 after a stroke which had left him, you can say, non-ambulant for almost 9 years. And he spent last 35 days of his life in AIIMS, All India Institute of Medical Sciences, and he was on life support. Now, when we look at these contrasting scenarios, they highlight the difference in the approaches to death that we see in the West versus what we see in India. The Euro-American nations, there we see that many people, they document their end-of-life wishes with the help of the same living wills. And here, those with terminal illness, they often receive palliative care instead of prolonged life support if their prognosis for recovery has been seen to be poor. And when it comes to the European ICUs, we see that only 10.3% of the terminally ill patients, they die on life support. In remainder of the cases, artificial support is either withheld or withdrawn, which is actually allowed, which actually allows them for a dignified death. So this is basically what we see in the Western countries, that we see that they use the living wills, they are common, and they allow the patients to choose the end of life care. And that's why we see that there are all these things with regard to the Western scenario. And that's why, as we discussed, that there are only 10.3%, only 10.3% of the terminally ill patients who die on life support. Only 10.3% patients who are terminally ill die on life support. Alright, so terminally ill meaning that it is ultimately going to lead to their death. Now in India what we have seen is that nearly 70% of terminally ill patients, they die on life support in the ICUs, and very often they are isolated from their families. And of the remaining 30%, many exit the hospitals through, you can say, left against medical advice or discharged against medical advice is what we call. That's something which is called as LAMA or DAMA. So left against medical advice, alright, left against medical advice or discharged against medical advice. So this is something which lacks a structured transition to palliative care in India. So that's why we see that 70% of the terminally ill, they die on life support in the Indian ICUs. Now, when it comes to this discrepancy, it leads to very tremendous suffering for both the patients and their families. There was a survey that was conducted in Pune, and it revealed that 83% of the participants, they preferred to die at home rather than dying in an ICU. This practice is, that's why also partially, you can say partly due to the belief that doctors should prolong the life even when treatment is going to be futile. Even if the treatment is not going to save the patient, yet we want that the doctor should try and prolong life even if it is not going to help. But this is not in line with what Indian Council of Medical Research definition of duty of care is, which prioritizes mitigating the suffering of the patients. So that's why you have to understand that when we talk about the Indian Council of Medical Research and how it talks about what duty of care is, what duty of care is for the doctors. Now, this duty of care is something that has to prioritize mitigating the suffering, right? So it has to prioritize the mitigation or mitigating the suffering. So if we add to this, the death in the ICU, it only has become, you can say, normalized in the recent decades in India. And that's why, in a manner, what we can call this as is a death illiteracy. A society that avoids discussing end-of-life wishes altogether, and we see that a lot of these things are not really well understood in India. And at the same time, what we also see is that India lacks specific laws on end-of-life care. Now, in this regard, when we look at the 2023 Supreme Court ruling, it basically allows advanced medical directives to be respected and support. It also supports the life support withdrawal when the treatment is going to be futile. However, when we look at the process still remains complicated and probably poorly understood also by the public and the professionals, because when it comes to a term, let's say the terms like passive euthanasia. So in case of passive euthanasia, what we see is that it is something that further confuses the matters. Withholding the life support when recovery is improbable allows the natural death to happen rather than actively causing that death. So that's why there are these kind of things that are also not very well understood in India, and that's why we see that there are certain issues with it. And that's why when we look at the World Health Organization, WHO, it has emphasized health as physical, social, and mental well-being. And the Indian Supreme Court recognizes the right to palliative care as a part of health rights as well. And that's why preparing a living will, witnessing it properly, and discussing it with the family can actually help the individuals to secure their rights to a peaceful death. So this perhaps is a way forward for India and how we look at healthcare and the end of life care in India. Moving on to the second article, that is plastic solution. Now, this again is an article that we have on your editorial page. Recently, we know that there was the Global Plastics Treaty, and this Global Plastics Treaty that was initiated by the United Nations, it involved at least 175 member nations, and this is something that aims to tackle the global plastic pollution. Now, recently concluding its fourth negotiation round, we saw that the initiative seeks establishing a legally binding agreement by the end of 2024. Now, this agreement will contain the timelines and the targets which will guide the nations to curb the plastic production, and at the same time also eliminate the wasteful plastic uses, ban certain kinds of harmful chemicals which are used in manufacturing, and also try to promote recycling practices. So these are the things that we want. So here we are basically talking about the Global Plastic Treaty. The Global Plastic treaty. Now, in this particular scenario, what we basically see is that by the end of 2024, we want to set timelines to reduce plastic production, to ban wasteful plastic uses, to prohibit certain chemicals, and to promote recycling practices. So these are the things that we are focusing upon. However, what we have seen is that the consensus, it remains very elusive due to economic concerns. The key oil producing nations such as Saudi Arabia or the United States, Russia, Iran, these nations, they have been apprehensive about the stringent deadlines for reducing the plastic production. In contrast, the coalition that has been led by the African nations with the European support, they have advocated for reducing the timelines that targets 2040 right now. Additionally, there also has been debates about the decision-making mechanisms within the treaty itself, and specifically whether the decision should be made by a vote or by a consensus. Now, this is something that when it comes to, let's say, a consensus, this is where it also grants each of the nations a veto power as well. Now, when it comes to India, India also has expressed reservations over the binding targets. And that's why India emphasized the need for alternatives that are accessible and also affordable at the same time. So that's why affordable and accessible alternatives is what India has been advocating for. Now, India also has advocated for support through capacity building, through technology transfer, and through financial assistance. Now, this is basically where we see that, so financial, technological support, and citing the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Now, when we look at the perspective of India, we also understand that this principle, when we talk about the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, it also mandates that while all the nations share a common goal, the wealthier nations should bear the stricter targets and support others in reaching these goals, right? This is basically what we mean by common but differentiated responsibility. So common but differentiated responsibility, so it basically, this is basically a principle. What does it say? It says that while all the nations have a common goal, that all nations share a common goal, but wealthier nations they should bear stricter targets. And at the same time also help others, so support others in reaching their goals as well, and support others in reaching their goals. Alright, now in 2022, India implemented the Plastic Waste Management Amendment Rules, and this is something that banned 19 categories of single-use plastics. Alright, so this is something that we had seen, that 19 types of single-use plastics, they were banned. Yet, when we look at the enforcement has been inconsistent, and the ban does not include plastic bottles or multi-layer packaging, etc. So that's why we see that there are these kinds of problems, that we have seen that there has been an exclusion of, it does not include the plastic bottles, and the multi-layer packaging plastics that we have, multi-layer packaging. So these things, they are not included. Now, when we look at countries like India, Brazil, China and the US, you'll see that 60% of the plastic waste is being generated by only these four countries. And the treaty requires substantial investment in developing affordable alternatives before the nations can actually realistically achieve their ambitious targets. And the final negotiation round, which has been scheduled for November in Busan in South Korea, it remains very, very critical in trying to resolve these kind of challenges that we are focusing on right now. Now coming to the third article, and this is about what high temperature maps get wrong about heat waves. Now when we talk about heat waves, and this is something that has been a consistent discussion that we have had over at least the last 4-5 years, and this is about the heat waves, that heat waves are increasingly gaining their attention due to the rising intensity, the duration, the frequency and the scale across the various different regions globally. So that's why we see that they have become more intense, they have become more frequent, then we see that they are longer across many different countries. Their scale has been larger, their duration, their intensity, the duration, the scale, all these things have been bigger. Now, very often they occur predictably as spring arrives, and it forms a consistent pattern which is known as climate. But this is where we need to also understand that climate is one thing, but weather patterns are very inconsistent. The consistency means that the regions like, for example, Indian subcontinent, we can anticipate the heat waves around March. And predicting these heat waves precisely, however, it becomes a very, very big challenge. And particularly on a local scale. And India basically is improving its ability to forecast these events and trying to manage disasters. But when it comes to accurately depicting the heat waves for the public, it becomes very, very crucial and very difficult at the same time. So that's why when it comes to precisely predicting the heat waves, it's very, very challenging, and particularly on a local scale. So for example, when we talk about weather versus climate, you know the difference between weather and climate. That climate is when you take the sum average of at least 20 to 30 years and more, and weather is what you see as the day-to-day changes in the temperature, the precipitation and all the other climatic factors. So that's why we say that climate is what you expect and weather is what you get. So that's why when it comes to the local scale, it becomes very crucial and difficult also to handle and predict the things. And there's a recent trend of using alarming total temperature maps, even by very reputed organizations like NASA or ISRO. While these maps, they convey the urgency, they can actually also mislead, because heat waves are defined by anomalies in the temperatures, but which basically are higher than expected in the seasonal norms. So that's why there are total temperature maps and there are anomaly maps. Now the total temperature maps can actually obscure the essential details which are needed for effective disaster management. And so that's why we see that this can be misleading, and they actually emphasize on absolute temperatures rather than the anomalies that we see that define the heat waves. So that's why total temperature maps many a times can be misleading, and they might obscure the essential details. Alright, they might obscure the essential details which are needed for effective disaster management. But at the same time, when we look at anomaly maps, they are the ones that highlight the deviations from the average, and that's why they become very, very crucial. They highlight the differential, the differences, the temperature deviation from the historical norms, and that's why they provide more accurate insights, and they become essential for effective disaster management. Now, so that's why when it comes to the anomalies in temperatures, we see that they are calculated by subtracting the historical averages from the current temperatures, right? So for example, let's say if the typical temperature is around 30 degrees Celsius, but the current reading is 34 degrees Celsius, then the anomaly basically is of 4 degrees Celsius, right? So that's why historically, let's say climate wise, you would say that okay, the temperature should be 30 degrees Celsius, but what you are witnessing right now is 34 degrees Celsius. Then it means that the anomaly is what? Anomaly is of plus 4 degrees Celsius. So that's why these maps, they help in identifying where the temperatures deviate from the norms, and that's why they provide very crucial information for focused disaster response. And many a times when it comes to total temperature maps, they very often they over dramatize the conditions, and that's why they might mislead the public by inaccurately depicting the real threats. And that's why predicting the anomalies on a localized level becomes very vital, given that the resources are also limited even in the developed nations also. And that's why when we look at a national approach to disaster prediction, it becomes very difficult. It becomes a very impractical way, because instead we have to do the forecasting on a very smaller localized scale. So that's why it becomes very, very crucial that you look at the temperature at a local stage, you look at all the conditions, all the weather conditions at a local scale, and all the mitigation activities also should be localized instead of having a national approach to it. And that's why exaggerated maps, they may raise the awareness, but they risk undermining the credibility if the forecasts, let's say, are inaccurate. And India's forecasting system, which operates at a resolution of almost 12 kilometers for short and medium term forecasts, it works very closely with the disaster management agencies as well to disseminate the early warnings and try to protect lives as much as possible. And improving the forecasting accuracy by downscaling these models using maybe artificial intelligence and machine learning, it might help in tailoring the predictions to a very small scale, even a neighborhood level. And that is something that will benefit not just the heat wave predictions, but also in agriculture, also in health sector, also in energy sector. So that's why this is something that is very, very crucial. That, long story short, we are saying that the forecasting should be localized instead of national level forecasting. And where does it help? It helps in agriculture, it helps in the energy sector, it helps in the healthcare sector. So we'll see that it will help in all these cases, and that's why it becomes very, very crucial from the perspective of how we need to go about these things. Now coming to the next article, the unseen effects of climate change on mental health. Now this is an article that we have on the science page today. Now what we know is that India currently is experiencing soaring temperatures, where we see that several regions are facing unprecedented heat. Now while it's very challenging to directly attribute each heat event to climate change, there is a growing understanding that climate change is contributing to an increase in the heat anomalies. And this is something that is also affecting a broader range of areas with greater intensity as well. Now this phenomenon, this disproportionately also affects the society's most vulnerable members as well, such as those who have health issues, the elderly, the poor, and the marginalized societies. Now climate change also has given rise to various psychological issues as well. For example, eco-anxiety or eco-paralysis or solastalgia. So for example, solastalgia or eco-anxiety and all these kind of psychological issues, or eco-paralysis, also what we call as eco-paralysis. So there are all these kind of issues that are also rising in number. Now this contributes to widespread concerns about livelihoods and the future. Now there was a recent study, and this study was published in the journal called as GeoHealth. Now this study that was published in GeoHealth, it revealed that when it comes to extreme heat events, it analyzed the extreme heat events in British Columbia in Canada, and this was done in 2021. Now it found that people with schizophrenia, they were more severely affected than those with heart or kidney diseases. And why is it important? Because traditionally it is believed that anything related to heat, anything related to heat effects will affect those people more who have heart disease or kidney related diseases. Yet what we saw was it was affecting people more who are suffering with schizophrenia. Now in this particular scenario, the study actually compared over 1600 deaths that happened in 2021 to the data from the same period 9 years earlier, and found that the individuals who had schizophrenia, they were disproportionately impacted by heat related deaths. Now this greater vulnerability, it is also linked to the dysfunction of the hypothalamus, which we have in the brain, and it is, you can say, the brain structure responsible for regulating the body temperature and maintaining what we call as homeostasis. So that's why what we basically have seen is that there have been a 200% increase in the schizophrenia related deaths compared to a period without heat waves 9 years ago. Now what we basically see is that in this particular scenario there is a hypothalamus dysfunction. And hypothalamus, what does hypothalamus do? Hypothalamus helps in regulating body temperature. Alright, hypothalamus basically helps in regulating, it regulates body temperature. Alright, it regulates body temperature and maintains what we call as homeostasis. So it maintains homeostasis, right? So when it comes to so I'll just write it that it maintains homeostasis. Alright, homeostasis, basically you can say regulation of temperature inside the body. So it maintains homeostasis. Now what we basically see is that when we look at antipsychotic medications, they are very frequently prescribed to the individuals who have schizophrenia, and it is something that can actually disrupt the hypothalamic functions, which leads to elevated body temperatures. Now combined with extreme heat, this effect actually can become fatal for these patients. Now people with schizophrenia, they are also susceptible to additional risk factors such as psychotic symptoms, where you might see various different conditions. For example, let's say you might have anosognia. So when it comes to these kind of functions or these kind of diseases, these kind of problems, there are risk factors related to these situations as well. Now, so that's why, for example, let's say when we talk about the anosognosia, so this is a disease where you have a lack of awareness of the condition, and at the same time we see that there are comorbidities, for example diabetes. So there are additional risk factors here, and a social isolation or a lower economic status, it further heightens their vulnerability to heat related illness. Now despite the risks associated with some antipsychotic medications, the scientists have advised against discontinuing these kind of essential treatments. Instead, interventions like counseling, family support, or even having a caregiver awareness, it is something that needs to be prioritized to mitigate the impact that happens to the vulnerable groups. So that's why there are other aspects that we have to think upon. So that's why we see that schizophrenia related symptoms and comorbidities, they make seeking help difficult, and social isolation and economic challenges, they can increase the vulnerability or exacerbate the vulnerability. When it comes to, okay, this is a new word. So when it comes to this word exacerbate, this is a word which is used when you are saying that something is increasing in the negative sense. So for example, when you talk about climate change and what it can do to human health, so when you talk in that sense that it is increasing the number of accounts of health related, or let's say heart related or kidney related diseases, you will use the word exacerbate. So that is basically the word, so a new word adding to your dictionary. So now in this particular scenario, this study, it has underscored the value of the multifaceted or understanding of the multifaceted effects of climate change, and that's why it has revealed how extreme heat can actually compound rapidly, and it can disproportionately impact the individuals, and that's why it adds another layer to the already complex challenge that is being put forward by climate change. So this climate crisis, that's why needs to be understood better, that how exactly do we go about it. So that's why what happens here is that the medications, why are we looking towards these kind of mental issues? Because when, let's say, especially in terms of schizophrenia, the medications that are taken, those medications, they can increase the body temperature. They increase the body temperature, and that's why people who are already fighting comorbidities, or if there are other heat related effects, they are going to be more pronounced in these patients. So that's why but what the scientists are saying, that the solution is not to stop that medication. You cannot stop the medication, yet there are other aspects that we have to look upon, that how family support or caregiver support or counseling etc. can really help in this particular regard. Now coming to the prelims based article, the first article that we have is on page number 5. Kerala on alert as man dies of West Nile fever. Now what exactly do we mean by West Nile fever? Let's try to understand that. West Nile disease is an illness which is caused by the West Nile virus, and this is a mosquito-borne virus. Now this is a disease which is a mosquito-borne disease. It is something that can affect humans, birds, horses and many other animals. Now this disease, this is primarily something that spreads to humans through the bite of an infected mosquito. So that's why remember some of these terms. So that's why horses, birds, humans, these three can be affected, and the vector, the carrier is the Culex mosquito. The Culex mosquitoes, they become the carrier or the vector for this virus, and they are the one that lead to this disease. Now when it comes to the symptoms of the disease, there are various different symptoms. So for example, in mild cases, some people are asymptomatic or they have very mild flu-like symptoms. For example, fever, headache, body aches, joint pain, vomiting, diarrhea or rashes. All these can be there in the mild cases. Alright? So in mild cases, you might see that the symptoms are like flu, right? So you have flu-like symptoms. Flu-like symptoms. So that's why when we say flu-like symptoms, we are talking about fever or headache, right? So fever, headache, body aches, rashes. So all these basically can be there. Even vomiting, joint pains, diarrhea, etc. they can be there. Now when it comes to the severe cases, if we talk about the severe cases, now in severe cases, a small proportion of the people who are infected, they develop very severe neurological symptoms. For example, there can be brain inflammation that they might see, or maybe meningitis can actually develop in their brain. So that's why there are these symptoms which are possible, and these symptoms, they include high fever, stiff neck, or other aspects like even coma or tremors or seizures. Even paralysis is what can happen in these patients. So that's why in case of severe cases, we see that there are chances of neurological symptoms. There are neurological symptoms, and that's why it can go very far. Now, when we look at the risk factors, what we see is that older adults and those who have weakened immune system, they are at a greater risk for severe illness, and there is no direct medication, so prevention becomes very crucial. Reducing mosquito exposure by maybe wearing long sleeves and pants, etc., or using mosquito repellents, or maybe also ensure that doors and windows, they are screened. So all these things can help. And also eliminating standing water where mosquitoes can breed easily, that is also something which is required. So that's to just understand that treatment wise there is no specific antiviral treatment. The mild cases, they often recover without even medication requirements, but in case of severe cases they might require hospitalization or supportive care, because otherwise ultimately it can also become fatal in certain cases. Then the next article that we have is again on the science page, and this is about a disease that we have seen, or an insect that we have seen on maize. Now what we have basically seen is that global warming has brought Argentina's corn farmers to a very new enemy, or a dangerous new enemy, which is a yellow colored insect which is just 4 millimeters long. Alright, this insect, as you can see here, this is an insect, this is an insect which is just 4 millimeters long. Now this is an insect that thrives in hotter temperatures, and it is something that is threatening the harvest of this crop. The name of this is leaf hopper. The name is leaf hopper. Alright, so leaf hopper, what do we know? It is yellow in color. It is almost 4 millimeters long. Right? It is just 4 millimeters long, and it is something that thrives in hotter temperatures. It thrives in hotter temperatures. Now, what we have seen is that when it comes to corn or maize, you have to know that when it comes to Argentina, Argentina is world's number 3 corn exporting country. And we have seen that they have slashed millions of tons from their harvest projections from the current crop due to this rare plague of this insect that actually can carry a stunt disease that can damage the cobs and the kernels of this particular plant. And that's why the farmers, they fear that such kind of infestation, it can actually become more regular with maybe few, because what they have seen is that there have been fewer frosts in the recent years. So what they have seen is that there have been fewer frosts in the recent years. Alright, in the recent years, and that's why otherwise frost is something that checks the insects spread. Now that's why what we see is that there are forecasts for even warmer winter in the coming days and years. So that's why what we see is that farmers, they are very worried about all these things. Some of the farmers, they already have said that they will sow less corn for the next season in favor of some of the other crops such as the soy. So they would prefer soy instead of corn, because they already are afraid what would happen to the next season as well. So that's why we see that when it comes to corn, we have to understand that it becomes Argentina's one of the most important main cash crops, and which and in case of soy also is very, very important, and soy is not affected by these bugs. So that's why the agriculture and the climate experts, they have also linked that this kind of unusual outbreak that we have seen is happening because of the global and the local temperatures rising. The leaf hopper numbers in the northern Argentina, for example, they are 10 times the normal levels, while when it comes to the insects, they have been found even almost 1500 kilometers south of the traditional areas, meaning that they now are even being found in the colder areas, which previously they were said to be too cold for these insects to even be present. But unfortunately, due to the global rise in temperature, we now see that their numbers in the southern parts which are away from the equator, there also these numbers are rising. Now coming to the revisited headlines for the day, again a continued discussion on the Israel-Palestine issue, on the Gaza crisis. What we see is that on Tuesday, the Israeli tanks, they captured the strategically important Rafah border crossing in Gaza. And they have completely ignored the urgent appeals that were made by the international allies of Israel as well. And this offensive, it came despite the ongoing precarious ceasefire negotiations that are going on with Hamas. And recently, I mean yesterday also we had discussed this, that Hamas was agreeing to what Egypt and Qatar have put forward. But unfortunately, from the Israeli side, we still do not see any positive action. The United Nations, they have voiced the concerns that this action could severely disrupt the essential aid flow into Gaza, and particularly through Rafah and the Karim Shalom crossing, both of the crucial aspects of the points for the humanitarian assistance. Though Israel's latest operation, it wasn't a comprehensive assault on Rafah that was anticipated, yet it has signaled potential further escalation here. We saw that when it comes to the US President Joe Biden, he had urged Israel not to invade the city, and particularly given that over 1 million Palestinians are concentrated in these areas. Yet what we saw was that following Israeli orders for almost 1 lakh people to evacuate parts of Rafah, families have begun to flee from these areas. Many actually have used, many use any kind of available means, including donkey carts, or even to carry whatever belongings they have and to find safer shelters. But the destination for most of these people, it remains completely unknown. Where exactly will they go? Nobody knows, and nobody can even imagine. So unfortunately, the things are not going in a positive direction. And in the same regard, the hostage families, they seek foreign pressure for Gaza ceasefire. The families of the hostages currently who are held in Gaza, they are urging the United States and the other governments to press Israel into reaching an agreement with Hamas to secure the hostages' returns as well. And their appeal to the foreign ambassadors, it comes after this recent indications of a progress towards a potential truce in this particular conflict. And they have emphasized the importance of leveraging the diplomatic influence to also try and support a deal that could bring back their loved ones, who could include citizens from the US, from the UK, Thailand, France, Russia, all these countries. So that's why we see that there are these kinds of things that are being put forward by the hostage families. Now coming to the last article of the day, advertisers should submit self-declaration before promoting products, Supreme Court. Now the Supreme Court of India has issued a directive requiring advertisers to submit self-declarations which confirm that they are not misinterpreting or making false claims about their products before promoting them in the media. So that's why they have been asked that they should actually submit a self-declaration. They have to submit a self-declaration before they go to the media with their advertisements. Now, in this particular regard, the advertisers who are planning to run television advertisements, they now must upload their self-declarations on the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting's Broadcast Seva portal, and provide a copy to the broadcaster as well. So they actually have to submit, they have to upload the self-declaration. They have to upload their self-declaration on Broadcast Seva portal. Alright, So they have to upload their self-declaration on the Broadcast Seva portal, and a similar portal for print advertising must also be set up by the ministry within the 4 weeks, is what Supreme Court has said. Now, social media influencers, celebrities, public figures, they also have been urged to be responsible and avoid endorsing any of the deceptive advertisements. The court also emphasized that anyone endorsing a product should be adequately informed about the product as well. Furthermore, what the Supreme Court also directed was that the government should establish a clear process for the consumers also to file complaints against any misleading ads or misbranding, so that we can ensure that they receive the updates on their complaint status. So that's why public figures should be informed, and they also have to be careful. Then there should be a portal for consumer complaints as well, right? So that's why there has to be a process for consumer complaints. Process for consumer complaints as well. And in addition, what we also see is that the union government, it retracted an Ayush ministry letter that had actually paused Rule 170 of the Drugs and Cosmetics Rule of 1945, which regulates objectionable advertisements. And lastly, what we see is that the Ministry of Health has been also instructed to compile data on the complaints that have been received by the Food Safety and Standards Authority of India in concerning the misleading advertisements and misbranding of the food and the health products. So that's why we see that this comes in the context of all the recent developments that we see, whether it is the Patanjali case, whether it is a Nestle case, in all these kinds of cases. Now coming to the mains questions of the day, the first question: discuss the ethical, cultural and legal challenges in implementing effective palliative care and advanced medical directives, that is living wills, in India. Suggest measures to improve the quality of end-of-life care. So we discussed the difference between the Indian and the Western practices and what needs to be done and what are the things that can actually help a person towards the end of their life. So those kind of points is what you have to bring in writing this answer. Then the second question: discuss the multifaceted impact of extreme heat events on vulnerable populations. So extreme heat on vulnerable population. Analyze the role of climate change in exacerbating these challenges and suggest the targeted policy measures to mitigate the risks. So again, something that we have been discussing not only in the context of what we discussed today with regard to mental health, it actually adds a new aspect to all the discussions that we have been doing around heat waves. So that's why, or not only heat waves, rather extreme climate or extreme heat that we have been witnessing all across the globe. So this is it for today's session. I hope that this session was helpful for you. Please do subscribe to our channel and be regular with all our videos. Thank you very much for being here.